Hello, wonderful people. So, this series is going to be about growth and development. Now, I did go ahead and split up this lecture from the overall PowerPoint into multiple different episodes, per se. So that way you don't have to sit and listen to me talk necessarily for hours straight. Give yourselves a little break there from that. But this will be the first video out of 7. So make sure that you watch the other ones, after this. Otherwise, let's get into it. So in this section, we're going to talk about developmental theories and why they matter in nursing practice. Human development is influenced by many factors. So things like genetics, environment, gender, birth order, culture, and life experiences. No two people develop in exactly the same way. Developmental theories help us understand patterns in how people grow, think, behave, and interact across the lifespan. Now, as nurses and healthcare workers, this knowledge helps us provide age appropriate, patient centered care. It helps us improve communication and set realistic expectations for patients and families. Now, these theories also do align with Healthy People 2030, which focuses on promoting health and wellness across the entire lifespan, not just treating illness. Now, HESI tip. If you see a question asking why developmental theory matters in nursing, the correct answer almost always includes age appropriate care, communication, education, or understanding behavior, not diagnosing psychological disorders. We'll start with psychoanalytical theory, which focuses on how early life experiences shape personality. Sigmund Freud introduced the structural model of personality made up of the id, ego, and superego. These terms show up frequently on exams, so it's important to know the basics. Freud also believed that personality develops through a series of psychosexual stages during childhood. While some of his ideas are controversial today, they laid the foundation for many later theories and emphasized the importance of early childhood experiences. Now, with Hesse does not expect deep psychoanalysis. They want basic definitions and stage associations, such as knowing the oral, anal, phallic, latency, and genital phases of Sigmund Freud's theory. Now, the id. Okay, the id is the most primitive part of the personality. It operates on the pleasure principle and seeks immediate gratification. Think of the id as instinct driven, hunger, thirst, impulses, with no concern for rules or consequence. So when you think the id, think, I want it now. For the ego is the rational problem solving part of the personality. It operates on the reality principle. So we're looking at balancing the desires of the id with the rules of society and real world consequences. So when we think ego, think what's realistic? For the superego, this represents our moral conscience. It includes internalized values, ethics, and societal expectations. The superego helps us decide what is right or wrong. So, when you think superego, think, what should I do? Now, Carl Jung expanded Freud's ideas and challenged the belief that development ends in childhood. He believed that psychological growth continues throughout adulthood. He described age 40 as the quote, noon of life, a turning point where people shift from focusing on external goals like career and family to internal reflection, meaning, and self understanding. This idea is important in nursing because it reminds us that adults continue to grow. We continue to adapt and change, especially during life transitions. Now, HESI tip. If a question refers to or continued development in adulthood, I apologize, Jung is going to be your correct theorist. Erik Erikson. Now, with Freud, okay, so we talked about Freud. Um, Erikson is another big one. So you'll see we're going to be talking about a lot of theorists in this short amount of time here. There are some that are more important to know than others, okay? And I will be providing additional materials for you all on those real, big hitter theorists and developmental theories. Just know Erik Erikson is probably the biggest one, okay? So, again, one of the most important developmental theorists for nursing exams. Okay. Now, Erikson focused on how social relationships and culture influence development. So he described 8 psychosocial stages, each with a central conflict that must be resolved for healthy development. Now, these stages span the entire lifespan, from infancy to older adulthood, which makes Erikson extremely relevant to nursing practice. Okay, I want to repeat again. This is very high yield HESI content. Okay, I'll continue on. So let's briefly walk through Erikson's stages. You do not need to memorize long descriptions for these, okay? Now, HESI typically focuses on matching the correct stage with the correct age group and conflict. So let's go through them. Infancy. Trust versus mistrust. So, this is learning whether caregivers are reliable. Can my caregiver feed me and shelter me and comfort me to where I can trust them? If not, that's when we have mistrust start to form. In early childhood, we see autonomy versus shame. This is where we develop independence. Okay, this is where you have that child who is pouring that huge gallon of milk over that tiny, tiny little cup. And most of it ends up on the floor rather than ending up in the cup. Now, as adults, we can respond in one of two ways. We can either say, oh, my goodness, that was a heavy gallon of milk, wasn't it? Oh, let's go ahead and clean up our mess. Or, oh, don't cry over spilt milk. You shouldn't have picked that up anyways. It's too heavy for you to do. See the difference? So, with this, it's can the child feel autonomous at times where they are doing things for themselves? Or are they going to feel shameful because maybe they're not doing it right the first time? Now, in preschool, we see initiative versus guilt. So, taking initiative in play and activities. Is the child, going and running to that sensory table and getting their hands dirty? Or do they kind of, stray away from it because, well, they feel guilty for getting dirty in the sensory table? For school age, we have industry versus inferiority. So, building competence and skills. Think in roughly middle school, okay, where you're just starting to get in some good content that you're going to, use for a good duration of time. You're starting to build those first, you know, um, preteen friendships that seem so much more prevalent and important when you're living in that time frame, right? But that's what we're talking about with school age. Now, adolescence, identity versus role confusion, forming a sense of self. So, is the adolescent confident in their abilities or, their talents and know what they want to do with their life and how they want to be and come off as? Or, you could be like me, for instance, as an adolescent, and I had no idea what I wanted to do. I had no idea what I could be, right? And we see this one is a really good example where, these stages don't just have to happen in their designated time frame. Now, what I mean by that, okay, is that per textbook, so for your exams, yes, adolescence is identity versus role confusion. But I know plenty of adults, middle adulthood, young adulthood, even older adulthood, that have no idea, what their role is supposed to be in their life or what they want to do when they grow up, to say. So in real world nursing, we can see these stages amongst various age groups. Now, for young adulthood, intimacy versus isolation, forming close relationships. This is typically around the time when people try to find a partner, just statistically. And so it's either are we able to find and build those loving relationships, or do we tend to isolate, whether it be purposeful or maybe subconsciously? Now, for adulthood, we have generativity versus stagnation. So, am I contributing to society? Or am I really not doing my part and leaning towards that stagnation side? Then, lastly, we have older adulthood, integrity versus despair. So, reflecting on life with acceptance, that would be the integrity. But if we look back with regret, right? Oh, I should have done this. I should have spent more time doing this. Or not having that fulfillment, that's when we're looking at leaning towards the side of despair. Now, with HESI questions, if a question describes a behavior, identify the age, and then match it to the Erickson stage. So, again, I cannot repeat this enough. You need to know this. You need to know this, okay? Now, Erickson's theory helps nurses understand patient behaviors, coping styles, and emotional needs. So this really isn't something that is just needs to be, memorized for an exam. It really does help guide our practice. So, for example, a hospitalized toddler struggling with independence is experiencing autonomy versus shame, while an older adult reflecting on their life may be working through integrity versus despair. Understanding this allows us to provide developmentally appropriate support, education, and communication. Okay, now we are going to actually leave it there for the first section. Okay, so the high yield takeaways for this section. Developmental theories explain patterns, not rigid rules. Okay. Now, we talked about Freud, who we see personality structure and early childhood. For Jung, we looked at developmental or development continues into adulthood. Erickson, most tested for nursing exams. I have said it so many times for a reason, my friends. And then always match age to the behavior and then to the theory. Okay, now our next section coming up, section 2, we are going to be looking at cognitive development with Piaget, Loevinger, and Keegan.